Good morning and welcome to FPRI's seminar and panel discussion on doing business in Africa. Many people in the United States think of Africa as a single place, and usually in a negative context, especially when it comes to doing business. And we have with us this morning three very experienced panelists who have a lot of experience and expertise on it. But before we get into the panel and our subject, I'd like to welcome all of you to this. This is the first seminar that we have done at FPRI on doing business in Africa, and presentations like this are made possible by the support of those of you who attend these events and who are members of FPRI. We encourage you, if you're not, to consider joining. On behalf of our president, Raleigh Flynn, who was unable to be with us today, I'd like to thank you for joining us and to solicit your continued support. A reminder, if you have questions of the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A box during the presentation. We will get to them about the halfway mark through this presentation. And if you have, and please don't put them in the chat box, we might miss them. And with that, I would like to introduce our four panelists. We have Professor Carla Jones from the University of Sam Houston State University in Texas, who is Associate Professor in Management, Marketing, and Information Systems. She's also a Templeton Fellow of FPRI. We have Ned Rauch-Mannino, who's a former senior official with the U.S. Department of Commerce and the U.S. Agency for International Development. We have Professor Fred Olayele, who is a prominent academic in government finance and information development. And finally, Ms. Yvonne Rivers, who is a principal of a marketing group that is involved in global marketing and is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And with that, I'm not going to go into a lot of introduction, other than to say, just to set the stage, Africa is one of the fastest growing and youngest continents in the world, and is poised to be an economic engine for growth globally in the coming decades, something that American businesses should keep in mind. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Jones for her presentation.
Okay, good day. I'm going to start broad with the full continent and narrow our discussion to Kenya. The businesses in the U.S. Need to consider and adjust their approach to doing business on the continent as building a relationship more than a transaction, because the environment on the continent is very complex. One is to recognize who the competitors are, not just the local businesses in the country, but also that there's competitors from mainly China and others that might be coming from the from the EU. How might outsiders find their way? One part is alignment with the political party in power. The political party in power is allowing for cross-ethnic and possibly cross-tribal connections and interactions. Recognize that there may be some resource allocations that are dependent upon political and ethnic considerations, and to align with the political party in power says that there's an opportunity to minimize risk. There's some long-term partnerships that can be shared if there's alignment with the political party that's in power, thereby aligning and maybe connecting with the idea of being trustworthy, loyal, minimizing risk, and being dependable. We have to also recognize that some countries have a weaker state of government and fewer checks and balances that may be in place. In some countries, we have more stable government and peaceful transition of leadership, and we'll talk about that more as we talk about the recent election in Kenya. So it's important to recognize who the dominant tribes are or ethnic groups and to align with those. The US also offers support in doing business in other countries, and especially what we're going to focus on in Africa. There's the US Commercial Service, which is a subset of the International Trade Association, who has the target of trying to promote business in rural communities with businesses from the US and communities that have been overlooked. So trying to promote that business elsewhere to help grow business connections and opportunities on the continent. This organization can be located at trade.gov, and they offer a lot of support to American businesses. Considering that 95% of the world's customers are outside of the US, it's a prime opportunity to develop our business contacts elsewhere. When we look at doing business in Africa, there are mainly three ways, I think, that business can take place or developing business connections can take place. There's the private sector, using the public sector, and then doing it on your own. So organizations like trade.gov can help to, would be considered the public sector, and can help to minimize some of the risk that may be involved. So when we look at why Kenya, we look at a mostly the most industrial developed country in East Africa, important source of high value minerals, mineral commodities. It's the economic, commercial, financial, and logistics hub of East Africa. In Kenya, we have a young, growing, and educated population that is fluent in technology. In Kenya, we also have strong bilateral relationship with the US, and the recent signing of the Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership, promoting trade and investment. This agreement has identified 10 areas for development of high standard commitments. The ideal is to increase investment, promote sustainable and inclusive economic growth, benefiting workers, consumers, and businesses. So again, Kenya is a strong strategic economy, diversified economy, growing diversification. There's an entrepreneurial workforce, comprehensive air routes, and status as a regional financial center. The projected GDP growth is good in the mid 5%. We have growth sectors of real estate, construction, technology. There are also some tourism is strong, had a really strong growth during COVID, which you would think the opposite because of the trade, because of the travel restrictions. However, there's some uncertainties that I want to mention. Worsening fraud, the impact of the war in Ukraine, employment rate in the mid 5%. However, that may grow. That may not be the best number, the 5%, because we have a lot of unrecorded informal employment and subsistence farming employment. The shilling is weakening to the dollar due to the rising cost of imports. We have the debt to GDP ratio to be concerned about. But finally, let's look at the Kenyan business environment. While the government is stabilizing with the recent transition of leaders, we have corrupt and weak governance, some government inefficiencies, weak regulatory and judicial systems. There's some land reform in place, perhaps strong inadequate protection of intellectual property, and a lot of low-cost Chinese imports. So we might say, why Kenya? I say, why not Kenya? There are a lot of opportunities. However, this, as one wise man once said, we're not planting grass, we're planting trees. So it has to be the relationship we're in for the long haul. And that wise man was Ambassador Ray.
Thank you. I never thought of myself as wise, but I appreciate that. Ned, I apologize. I keep butchering your name, but please, you're on.
Yeah. Hey, I butcher it myself every once in a while. So Ned Rauch-Mannino, presently one of the ambassadors, senior fellows, non-resident senior fellows for FPRI, and former senior officials, the ambassador mentioned, with the U.S. Department of Commerce and U.S. Agency for International Development. And part of my work with the administration going back a few years was to help stand up some of the programs to reorient the U.S. government's approach to enabling U.S. private sector firms to do business across the continent, everything from Cairo to Cape Town and everything in between, Kenya certainly included. And I think the opportunity is pretty significant. It's why we rolled out things like an enhanced Power Africa approach, as well as Prosper Africa, which was the bringing together of 17 different agencies and departments to help them understand how they can work better with one another, which you're now seeing in real time with the significant increase in trade and investment to some of the immediately prior years from the U.S. But I digress. To Dr. Jones's point, the opportunity is significant across the continent. 1 billion consumers represent about a quarter of the world's population in about 25 years, and a number of opportunities depending on the market you're looking at. And I think Dr. Jones also made a very excellent comment specific to the fact that to engage with the continent, you have to break it down. It's not simply one marketplace. It's more than 50 marketplaces. And even within each of those 50 marketplaces, there are multiple sub-marketplaces. Kenya is a perfect example. You have some of the most highly developed urban centers on the continent. You also have some rural areas that have some real issues with access to infrastructure, access to energy, and a few other obstacles. So getting at that on-the-ground sense of what the opportunities are and how to engage is probably the most important takeaway. If I had to promote one first step, it's getting exposure to the specific market you're looking at, whether it's Kenya or it's elsewhere across the continent. There are opportunities literally across the entire continent, but it takes some fact finding, it takes some due diligence, and maybe most importantly, it takes having some face-to-face engagement to build something more than just a commercial relationship, but something more than that. So it's just so important to have that presence on the ground, to be on the ground, to build that rapport and better understand the nuances of the specific market and target you're looking at. We can get into that over the course of the webinar here, but I simply wanted to make that point as we head into our round of introductions.
Thank you, sir. Professor Olayele.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think the broad issues have largely been covered, but perhaps we should look at the current geopolitical landscape and how that might impact what we see, in Africa and Kenya specifically. There's no question that these are unusual times, we're in the midst of rising geopolitical tensions and economic disruptions. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war is a major blow to the prospect of recovery in the global economy after the pandemic. It's weakened post-pandemic recovery. It's driving up inflation, which is a byproduct of COVID-19, and the inflationary pressure is complicating, the trend in higher energy and food prices, supply chain disruptions, and fiscal tightening. And all this is happening, at a time where countries in Africa are still struggling to recover from the pandemic. And obviously, Kenya is a prime example here, being the economic hub, in the East African region. So I know Dr. Jones and Mr. Mannino, cover some of the opportunities, but I thought that in terms of the political economic nuances, let's look at what Kenya has done, in recent times. Kenya has implemented significant reforms, that have contributed to sustained socioeconomic growth and relative political stability, at least over the last decade. And for a country with 54 million people and about $250 billion in GDP, that tells you they are now operating at capacity. A lot more can be done. So further structural and institutional reforms can unlock further private sector investment, which can in turn help in the fight against poverty, inequality, and the vulnerability of the economy to internal and external shocks. So to put that into perspective, between 2015 and 2019, the economy grew at an average of about 4.7% per annum. And if you are wondering what that meant for the period under review, poverty fell to about 34% at the $1.9 per day line, So all in all, the fact that Kenya is the commercial, financial, and logistics hub in East Africa is a big deal for businesses that are looking to go to Kenya from America, from North America, or elsewhere. And there are 3 key indicators that can also help to sum that up. First, it is a market-based economy with a dynamic and highly entrepreneurial workforce. Second, Kenya has got a young, growing, and tech-savvy population. I don't need to tell you about M-Pesa and how financial innovation has drastically changed the landscape there, And then thirdly, you talk about a relatively diversified economy with comprehensive air routes and its status as a regional financial center. So all in all, you frame that in the context of the development agenda, which is anchored on their Vision 2030, launched in 2008 by the former president, Kibaki, as a strategy to transform them into a middle income country. And then the immediate past president, President Kenyatta, focused on 4 priorities during his second term, the so-called Big Four: manufacturing, universal healthcare, affordable housing, and food security. And anytime I talk about Kenya in the context of doing business in Africa in the last 4 or 5 years, I always like to use that as a benchmark, to look at what they set out to do 5 years ago and what are the results. And for American, Canadian, and other Western firms going there, how has that policy, that strategy, how has it helped to define the opportunities? So finally here, Africa is highly heterogeneous. It would be unfair to paint 54 countries with a wide brush, but the general business environment in Kenya, it's not significantly different from what you see in many other countries. And I think for US firms, Canadian firms, and other players from the global north that are really looking to explore opportunities there, perhaps that framework is a good compass, to have an idea of what is the policy environment like, how is private capital flourishing, and then you put the Africa Continental Free Trade Area into that. If properly harnessed, foreign investors looking to penetrate the East and Central African region would most likely choose Kenya as an entry point. So that provides a general overview. I'm happy to delve into the nuances as we advance the conversation.
Thank you. Ms. Rivers.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I concur with what's been said already, Dr. Jones and Neil, as well as Dr. Fred, and I say this as I think the only entrepreneur on the panel here. I do business in Africa. In fact, I'm proud to announce that just this week, we registered our company, Phoebe Global, as a corporation in Kenya, the Republic of Kenya, specifically because we've been doing global for the past 13 years. And how we went global versus our US model, business model we've used since 1997. And it was strategic, quite frankly. And Dr. Carla, you relate, 75% of the business that you can get is outside of the United States. And I say to US businesses, why are you only dealing with 5% of the population? Go for the other 75, the other 95%. And that's where Africa and the continent, and it is a continent, a lot of times people have the idea, they say Africa meaning the continent, but it's 54 countries. And how we started, and just to tell you how we did it, is Phoebe Marketing Group. We are a marketing and strategic planning corporation. And it was the strategy of how we're going to get into Africa, how we're going to get into it, as well as who are our customers and where are they. And so mentioned, right, Dr. I think, Carla, you mentioned for his U.S. commercial service, that's data. That's simply data, but how you're going to translate that data into clients and how you really do it initially is developing collaborative partnerships. We already said that. Seeing where your customers are in Africa, that's with using their country guides and market research. But you also want collaborations. And I'm proud to say that I have collaborated with the Stevenson Group, which is a global consulting group based out of Washington, D.C. And they have people all over the world, per se. We have Ambassador Bob Perry, who's been stationed in Africa, as well as the founder, Ambassador Stephen McGann. So you look at what the resources you have. Now, we're a global company, and we have a team of 5. In fact, I have 2 key people who live in Kenya. You're probably on today. Edna, who's in Mombasa, and Sarah, who's in Nairobi, and another team member who's out of Zimbabwe, as well as someone here. We have 2 others here in the U.S. One is based out of Benin, originally from Benin, but here in the U.S. So you have to be on the ground to know the culture. You can't just say, I'm going to go to Africa and I'm going to do business in Africa. That's not going to work. I tell you now, don't even try it that way. But you've got to be strategic in how you're going to do it. What are you going to bring to them? And I always would say, don't try to come with a cookie cutter of a square or a round and fit them into it. It's not going to work. You have to really engage with people there. We know it's a youthful population, so the technology, as we say, I say some of the fallacies I've run across that people when doing business in Africa, they are not really, I guess, looking at the true level of expertise, education that Africans have. They are not just creatives and making necklaces and shea butter. So get that out of your mind. They're more innovative than that. And you've got to go with that flow there. And that's how you can really get the maximum regarding that. And relating to Kenya, we have other countries, but our focus is on Kenya. We're also dealing with Rwanda, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana. But we're focusing on that educational and training. We are really a training organization, educational organization for SMEs and NGOs. Because we have found, when someone mentioned the African Free Trade Agreement, that's fine and good. 49 countries have signed on to that. But what are they doing with it? Those just, it gives you trade options. But if they don't know how to trade, and not to say they can't know how to trade, you have to give them and what they need to do so. So I find that a lot of times they're not giving the specific logistics, the ABC, the 1, 2, 3. And that's where we come in and really providing and filling in a gap a lot of times, because there are a lot of US programs that will fund in Africa, USAID, World Bank, African Development Bank, but it's tying all that together. That's why I say it's not just a broad stroke, but it's a logistics regarding what can we do to really grow Africa. And see, this is what Africans are saying. They want to grow. They don't want the handout, or they don't want to export more than whatever they do. They want to look and turn that shea butter into a product and then export, where you get the maximum dollars. So, Africans are smart, just like US businesses, but you really need to come in with the idea, we're going to partner together. We're going to help each other. We're going to grow. We're going to measure our outcomes. We're going to measure our input. And because what we're looking at, if we really consider United Nations, there are 17 SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals. How are we going towards that, towards 2030? What have we produced with the billions of dollars that may be in access to Africa to grow them to the level that they really can? I'm not one, I'm going to set that high level. I'm going to set that balance high, because I believe that people can do that. Because I think Africans have been discounted for so many years in thinking because they're in Africa, they can't do certain things. That is simply not true. So I'll end it right there for now.
Well, thank you, all of you. Before we go to our audience, I have a few questions of my own that I'd sort of like to throw out. One of the issues, and it's been mentioned, one of the issues that a lot of American businesses are concerned about, and when I served in Africa and dealt with businesses, the question always came up is, what do you do about corruption? And I know that during the recent election in Kenya, this was one of the campaign issues that the 2 major candidates dealt with. And I'd like to start with you, Ned. What do you say to an American business person who's about to get on a plane and go to Nairobi to look for business opportunities? What do you say to this person about dealing with the issue of corruption?
I would say that you be prepared for what is probably Africa at large is, and whether it's true or not, but at large, the perception that corruption is the largest non-tariff trade barrier. I think the lack of uncertainty or inconsistency, as well as the kind of current of corruption in a couple of different places, has really made it troublesome for U.S. commercial endeavors to take a more serious look at Africa at large, when you have other opportunities with maybe more consistency in Europe or Asia or elsewhere. So much of its expectation setting, one individual commercial entity probably isn't going to change the corruption issues overnight, at least in the time span of that deal being complete, but rather to come in with the right expectations, to do that due diligence, to understand that here are some of the obstacles you're going to face. It could be corruption at the highest levels, which, if it's not the right opportunity or the right environment to bring your deal, then that's a individual decision, a commercial entity has to make or an investor has to make. But if it's some of the lower level corruption, the story you'll hear where a shipping container has been sitting at a dock for 3 months because something hasn't happened, quote unquote, that's something you probably have to then work some of those relationships, whether they're U.S. government relationships to help you resolve that that barrier, or whether it's your own due diligence working into the specific government to help undo that barrier. So there depends on the actual corruption, the actual obstacle. I think that begins with, again, the expectation setting to understand precisely the market you're entering and what the obstacles have been from some of the peer investors and peer exporters, what they've encountered. And really, again, that might be one of the first steps in any company's due diligence, to understand where the roadblocks have been encountered by other companies coming from the U.S. If it's a matter of shipping, there's something maybe lower level, maybe there's a quicker turnaround, a quicker workaround, something that has worked for other peer companies that can be worked through, or there's a specific point of contact in the respective government that you can work through to help resolve that. If it is the concerns of corruption at a higher level, get the sense of what the USG counterpoints working across the continent, what their guidance might be. They might A, have some better insight, B, be able to help alleviate that or maybe correct some perceptions, and maybe C, help steer your product to another market that maybe not has that specific barrier. But it's one of those things that won't change overnight, and it probably won't change an individual deal. I would tell you probably need some, not just commercial diplomacy, but greater diplomacy at large to help alleviate that. And I will quickly note, as I kind of turn to the rest of the group here, the value of U.S. commercial diplomacy and a U.S. value proposition. So often a U.S. firm can really make its concerns known by where it invests or refuses to invest, or where it exports or refuses to export. I mean, that's an opportunity that really can open up doors. If you bring an investment or an export to a specific market, that's an opportunity to push standards, push accountability, push transparency, push reform in a very meaningful way, because it has a commercial component to it, a relationship building component to it. But I think for a individual company trying to change corruption at large across the continent, I would advise start with setting your expectations, do the due diligence, talk to peer companies, get the U.S. government's insight for their perspective, and tread cautiously. And if it seems too detrimental, find another market. It's a very large marketplace.
Thank you. Would anyone else care to chime in?
Absolutely.
Professor Jones. Yeah.
I do agree, Neil, because that's with any business, no matter where you're going, Africa or wherever, you do your due diligence, you do your research and so forth. And I really call it, do your SWOT analysis, your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and threats, and know what those threats are. Because a lot of times COVID, we didn't know it was coming, but business owners know there's always threats. Don't say you don't have threats. And then based on where you're going, you have to decide on whether it's worth the while or not. I do agree for is the fact when you come in, building that relationship. And what I have found when I've come into the continent and working with different people on the ground in different countries, and I've got a team there, so I get some input maybe others don't have there, but you want to be able to understand the culture, the country, and so forth. And if there's something as a roadblock, walk away, be able to walk away. And regarding for its corruption and whether you're not going to get as much on a deal as not, you have to have that in mind anyway. Your expectations are based on what you see, and have your eyes wide open.
And to build on that, Ms. Rivers has talked about relationship and partnership. And ideally, you're trying to develop a win-win. So there's someone on the ground who is also invested and who's looking for a win, and their win is your win. At the same time, you know, if we stop saying, oh, there's corruption, it's not stopping some folks from doing business. So how are they successful in this corrupt environment? Is it that they speak the same corruption language? Because the fact that corruption is there is not stopping some folks. So what's the element that they're able to get around and be successful on the continent that is stopping other businesses from doing so?
Good point.
And I think I'll also jump in quickly. Again, that's always the elephant in the room, you know. But other panelists have said, I think the devil is in the detail, you know. Corruption is in Africa as it does exist elsewhere, you know. And oftentimes we shouldn't also forget the fact that some of the things you see happening could also be blown out of proportion, you know. But that being said, I do think that as Madam Rivers said, you know, you have a lot of American firms, you know, making gains and advancing their cause on the continent. What's the secret? Second is the fact that we are talking about Kenya here, you know, and I cannot overemphasize the importance of the digital economy. When you talk about digital finance, Kenya is the hub. And when you recognize Africa's highly heterogeneous economic, political, social, and technological dynamics, you have to acknowledge Kenya's relative success. Let's take tax design and revenue administration as an example. You know, the role of the M-Pesa in the transformation of the financial technology space and the innovation success story in Africa and Kenya specifically. And that has also permeated even the fiscal policy domain, such that reforms in the digital financial system, you know, has led to efficient and effective revenue mobilization. So all in all, corruption is real, it does exist, but as always, you know, it's important to work with key partners. You know, there's the whistleblower approach. A lot of US agencies are there on the ground, the Trade Commissioner Service. I know they also know a lot of reputable local partners who are individuals and corporates that have done a lot. So those support systems can provide a robust platform to help minimize adverse impact. That being said, corruption alone is not enough to serve as a deterrent for entrepreneurs and other investors looking to do business in Africa. And this is not an Africa-specific issue. Corruption is a global phenomenon. Depends on the coloration and how you want to interpret it.
Thank you. Good, very excellent points. One other issue, and then we'll go to our audience, and this refers to political stability and the sort of political environment that you're going to work in. And I've talked to a lot of business people, and of course, unfortunately, the Western media tends to, the stories they cover are the problems, and that creates a picture in people's minds. We just saw in the election in Kenya, the losing candidate took it to court. The courts ruled against him, and he accepted it and moved on, which is an excellent sign, especially in a country that had a history of post-election violence. What do you say to people about this issue of political stability on the continent? And let's start with Professor Jones.
I think we can only go up from here. I think we're in a great place to Kenya, when I say we, so, as I'm not sitting in Kenya. The political stability needs to be watched and sort of cultivated. So look at this transition, the government transition, and say, okay, who's in charge in terms of the tribal affiliation and the political party, as I had mentioned, and look at that as an opportunity to develop partnerships with those groups. Everyone is excited because of the political transition and that there wasn't fighting. So this is a great place to start. This is a great turning point for Kenya. And I think this needs to be an opportunity, as Professor Fred had mentioned, like, use this as an opportunity. This is an opportunity for a new path forward. And so I think it's a great place for Kenya, and only adds to the benefit of doing business in Kenya at this time.
Would anyone else care to chime in?
I definitely concur too. And not necessarily the only way up, but it's up. The direction is up. In fact, I've got some, since they knew that a lot of people knew I do work in Kenya, and some of the first questions after the election was, are they fighting in the streets? No. You know, and it's sort of like maybe an expectation, but because of past, I know that issue there. But when I said everything's calm, you know, just as Ambassador Ray said, it went to court and it settled. And quite frankly, I had my own dig in there. You know, United States is the only one that has problems with that now. But anyway, it's all good, because along with it, people are expecting the election. And then also people with collaborative partnerships, maybe people you're working with now maybe will be part of the new government. So that's the other side of it, because I deal in working with some government agencies. So it's just, yeah, are you part of the new government? Because that term of government, that's maybe another end for you as a business owner. So I look at all aspects of that.
But I would like to also quickly flag the informal sector, you know, in the context of political stability. The new President William Ruto, you know, has got work to do. So he's now inherited a post-COVID economy that is saddled with debt, high debt level, high unemployment, inflation, and a fragile global economy. Recently, the IMF called on Kenya, you know, to broaden its tax base and scrap the fuel subsidy. So you are wondering, what does that mean? During I don't know how many of you followed the electioneering campaign, but during the campaign, President Ruto largely framed his campaign in the context of bottom-up economics. You know, he said in one of his speeches that the contest was between hustlers, you know, and dynasties. So when you think about hustlers, I mean, you're pretty much talking about folks in the informal sector, the teeming youth without jobs in rural areas in the agricultural sector, young school leavers, you know, who don't know what their career would look like, young folks who are dissatisfied with the status quo, who are dissatisfied with a stagnant economy that cannot cater to their needs. So take that in the context of Ruto's campaign to take care of hustlers. And then you balance that with the Bretton Woods. IMF is saying you need to broaden the tax base. You know, in my Economics 101, we are broadening the tax base. You're thinking of bringing people from the informal sector, from the underground economy, you know, into the whole tax system. You want to scrap fuel subsidy? Oh, really? Look at the situation in Nigeria and other places where the petrol economy is a major issue when it comes to political economy. So you put all of that together, what do they mean for political stability? I mean, thankfully, Madam Rivers and Professor Jones talked about a hitch-free election and Ambassador Ray. That's good. But beyond the post-election crisis that many thought might define the current presidency, I think we've got to really look at the secondary effects of COVID-19, inflation, Russia, Ukraine. What do those things mean for his base, folks who really propelled him, you know, into power? That's going to really mean a lot, at least in the next 1 year.
Yeah.
Ned, you want to add anything to that, or?
I will quickly say that, you know, from our perspective, from the U.S. business community specifically perspective, you want to follow good performance. And if you have leadership that is demonstrating a commitment to maintaining stability and transparency, I think of Senegal with President Sall. I know he's had shortened the term limits for presidency, a couple other transparency policies, not complete fixes, but moving definitely in the right direction. You see that now with some opening up of the commercial market between the U.S. and Senegal. You see the same elsewhere across the continent. I'm sorry to divert from the Kenya focus, but I was trying to think of some leadership that's been in place for a few years that has demonstrated some really strong performances in this transparency space. So the hope is the U.S. broadly and specifically specific commercial interests will move into the markets that are making the right moves toward greater political stability, consistency, again, transparency. I think that's just a key piece and something that an individual company can undertake. So often we talk about these large policy conversations. They're almost not best entirely, but they're left up to governments to really decide in a diplomatic venue. The role of the commercial, the private sector, U.S. private sector, it's really transaction based and relationship based. But the relationships those companies make, folks watching online here, and the relationships they build, the deals they close, they all have an impact, and that impact can be leveraged. It should be leveraged. It could ideally be leveraged in places that are working toward those greater stability moves.
Right, thank you. And you made a good point. I think that needs to be underscored is that while we're talking about Kenya, I mean, Kenya is one of 54, well, 55 if you count Western Sahara, countries on the continent, and you can't look at Africa. You have to look at it country by country. Thank you very much for making that point. I'll go to questions from the audience, and the first question, and I guess sort of an Africa-wide, but let's start by focusing on Kenya. To what extent are African entrepreneurs investing? Did anyone have an inkling, insight into that, and would care to take a stab at that question?
I work with African entrepreneurs. In fact, the gist and direction and the marketing strategy of my company is coming in and helping these African entrepreneurs to grow so they can become global importers, exporters, and grow to the national market. And so they have to invest in themselves. Invest in themselves with education, with what it's going to take to put it together, no matter what industry they're in, whether they're in agribusiness. If it's agribusiness, they're farming and so forth. And actually, it's a U.S. company started here in the U.S., Hello Tractor, is in Africa and based out of Nairobi, Kenya. And that's offering the use tractors or like Uber with it. So these farmers can't really buy their tractor just for their own farm, but they use it and tie into it. So that's an investment. And they really are moving into, innovative technologies, whatever it's going to take for me to grow, to run my business better, to make more money. Because you've got to really back again to those threats, with farming, whether it's a drought, can you get water, where are you located, are you rural or whatever, and all of that. That's assessing all that. So yes, Africans are spending money in themselves. Now, whether they were doing it before, but I think you realize that the fact they've got to. There are no other options for that because no one's going to come in and completely subsidize or pay for you to make money in your business.
I might quickly add on top of that, you're seeing some of that innovation class kind of build up across the continent in pockets. Nairobi is a great example, Lagos, a number of others as well. And you're starting to see a response, I think, from the international investment community, impact investors, et cetera. But I don't know if anyone had caught Techstars. If you're not familiar with Techstars, I encourage you to.
Yeah.
They are launching their first incubator in Lagos, I believe, in the spring. So, and someone can quote me on find those dates to confirm them. But the first Techstars cohort for Nigeria, for anywhere on the continent, this is a wonderful development because it demonstrates there is creativity and there is a real promise there coming from African developed innovations, projects, companies, et cetera. So it'll be fun to see what startups come out of a cohort like that. I think it just speaks to sort of a trend that is picking up a great deal of steam. I love the Jahil Oliver example. Hello Tractor is a great success story as well. One to look up and see that investment back into your own community and just the embrace of innovation in a very practical sense too.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you, Neil, because actually I'll be on the ground in Nairobi from October 12th through the 27th, hosting a pitch competition for entrepreneurs, African entrepreneurs, to come in and get access to capital, learn how to do their training and marketing and so forth in a 3-month incubator accelerator. And it's bringing all the logistics, A to B, A to C, A to Z. So when they come out of it, they'll have outcomes so they can then grow their business. And that's what's needed. So we're coming in and bringing that and offering that opportunity.
Great, thank you. Another question here. The issue of footprint and presence on the ground is key. Africans are face-to-face communities and remote control doesn't work. How and when do you think better diplomatic representation will be done? Ned, you were in government.
Help to find better diplomatic representation. I think you can't just look at the chief of missions. I mean, I assume we're talking U.S. diplomatic representation. It has to go beyond chief of missions. So many of the posts on the continent are underrepresented compared to other posts across the globe. And this isn't simply just the Department of State posts. I look at the Foreign Commercial Service, my former stomping ground. You look at the 36 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are served, but only through, I believe it's 9 offices. And of those 9 offices, the staff is relatively small compared to the number of offices you'd have, say, in Germany. Now, I understand the difference between Germany or India in terms of commercial impact versus sub-Saharan Africa. It is very different. With that said, if you want to grow something, if you want to spark something and meet a growing economy, you have to have a presence there. And that's foreign commercial service officers, that's foreign ag service, that's equipping the ag service and the foreign commercial service with the tools, the resources, and the full-time equivalent staff they may need. It's bringing people up, making sure that post stops in each of this in sub-Saharan Africa is sort of a prerequisite at some stage in foreign service officer careers. It has to go beyond kind of just the role of the chief of missions, which I would love to see chief of missions confirmed, much faster, I think, in any administration, with the attention specific to Africa. With that said, it has to go beyond that because the longevity and the consistency of having great staff at post is key. And Ambassador, I'm sure you know this, you could speak to the value of having consistent staff and a full staff at post. I mean, that's worth its weight in gold. And it's a win for both sides of the equation. It's a win to have staff on the continent for your country you're working with, as well as your counterparts back home. So not to just say staff is the answer, but if I had a magic wand, the first thing I would do is open up a couple new offices. I could think of a few places on my wish list, but I think a couple more offices would probably help a great deal to really lean into not just diplomacy, but also commercial work and foreign ag service, and probably a development finance corporation, which has opened its doors in a really exciting way to attract U.S. investment and push it into the continent. Very meaningful work. They just need more bodies. My personal.
Thank you very much. No, it's interesting that question came up because 2 days ago we just did a review of the current administration's Africa policy, and one of the issues that was briefly discussed, and also that I discussed in an article I wrote about it, is that one of the keys to adding legitimacy and credibility to the policy would be to address this chronic understaffing of our embassies throughout the continent. I mean, it would be nice if all ambassadors were nominated and confirmed on time, but having an ambassador at post who doesn't have adequate staff is not answering that. That's a good. Anyone else care to? Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me throw one very quick point in there. It starts really, and I seeing this firsthand. So much of the other foreign services outside of state, they need help recruiting. And if there are any universities listening, I would strongly encourage them to reach out to the individual departments to see how pipelines can be set up, how recruitment can be done on campus, et cetera, to get graduates thinking about careers in the space. It is not a immediate career that comes to mind for a lot of folks. And if they think let's go overseas, it's typically let's go overseas via state versus a ag service or DFC or USTDA or or foreign commercial service. All the other opportunities to get engaged and lead that U.S. value proposition. So I will say that anyone listening from a university perspective, I would encourage you to pick up the phone to your local commerce or ag or DFC office.
Anyone else?
And just quickly, I agree for U.S. commercial services. We're connected to the U.S. commercial services in definitely Kenya, Rwanda, and so forth. And we find that's an inroad per se with the market on the ground. having my team in Nairobi, just to give you a quick example of that face-to-face that they're looking for. And because, you know, we're getting presenters and sponsors or supporters and sponsors for our event coming up in October. And so we have an entity, and they simply said, well, can one of your team members come by one day this week? And so I had my team member really set to go, but I wanted to be engaged with that. And so essentially I said, well, can they do a Zoom? Well, that's why I've got a Zoom at 3 a.m. tomorrow morning, because for them to stop face to face. So you do what you need to do. So I say that with African businesses. I have a global clock. You cannot be on that 9 to 5. So you've got to be there when you're trying to reach the people that you're trying to reach.
Right. One other question here from the audience that has nothing to do with Kenya, but it's an interesting question. Has Nigeria's freeze on dollar payments had an effect, good or bad, for business sentiment in other countries? Would anyone try to make sense of that question and answer it?
Well, I guess I'm the obvious corporate here. I'm originally from Nigeria, so but regardless, foreign exchange discusses, you know, monetary policy and other issues, you know, have really dominated the policy landscape in Nigeria, you know, for the past, say 7.5 years, you know, for the entire lifespan of the current administration, you know. And over time, they've had to move from one regime to the other, you know, maybe to go full blown or let it float, or, you know, but longer and short, I have to say that these are peculiar times, you know, COVID-19, geopolitical tension, increased digitization, the fall of multilateralism, even though it came back again. So all in all, it's going to be pretty difficult to generalize based on the Nigeria situation. I mean, look at Ghana. Ghana is the poster child for success in the Western African region in recent times. They struck oil, and that generated a lot of prospects for development and revenue mobilization to finance their priorities. But at the same time, in the last 1 year, if you are reading stuff, you know Ghana is also like in a deep mess. You know, look at Zambia, you know, the first country to default, you know, in bonds and what have you. So all in all, the currency situation is, it's a hot topic in Nigeria, but it would be unfair to use that to generalize for the entire continent. Again, Africa is not a country, 54 countries, maybe 55, depending on who you are talking to. I think we've got to really respect that heterogeneity, you know, and give the specifics to each country's economics, politics, and social dynamics. I don't know if that answers that question, but it is a complicated political economy.
Well, we're running close to out of time, and before we do close, I'd like to. Would any of you like to make any closing comments, Professor Jones?
I think we need to recognize the opportunity and embrace the difficulties and stay in and invest for the long haul when looking at doing business on the continent, and specifically looking at doing business in Kenya. Ride the wave of the stabilized government transition. Also be aware of the trade relationships that exist and the projected growth, and put some boots on the ground.
Ned?
I think if you have an interest in this market, in one of the many markets within the continent, then you should take it upon yourself to do a little due diligence, start exploring, start to meet some folks. And whether that is you're working through a US office like the US Commercial Service and Foreign Commercial Service, whether that is learning through webinars and conversations, such as this excellent one offered by FPRIs after the program, whether it's attending events like through the Corporate Council in Africa or through some of the other Africa market-focused engagement opportunities. There are a number of different avenues to start building that experience, that exposure to the opportunities overseas. At some point, of course, you have to go over there and start to connect. And There are a number of really great avenues to do that, and I've seen them at all levels, whether it's the U.S. big level, whether it's a think tank level, like through FPRI here, whether it's through the state of Minnesota every year does a great Minnesota trade event on Africa. Depending on what you're looking at and the market's trying to engage, there's probably a conversation for you that can take you from the interest stage to the inquiry stage. And then from that inquiry stage, you've got to get the travel stage and start building some relationships. So my advice is keep exploring. If you need help exploring, there are folks on this call that can certainly help that as well. And I wonder, Ambassador, if there's an opportunity to, we are open to be contacted, I'm sure. But if there's interest in taking the next step, find a group that will help guide you to that next step and go for it.
Great, thank you. Professor Olayele.
Well, I will end by saying that, like Albert Einstein, in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. And when we look at the medium to long term, particularly in the context of the ongoing economic rebalancing and strategic geopolitical realignment, there's a lot of opportunities abound. And for investors, it will be important to look at the interplay between politics and economics in the current global economic order, particularly the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, and how that is changing the whole landscape. If you look at the recent flow of international private capital, I'm talking about the venture capital economy. Look at the amount of funds that have gone from the US to Africa, into the fintech space. Look at the African diaspora in America. They are doing a lot back on the continent. Back in the day, you talk about diaspora remittances to take care of family and other people. Now the discourse is around investing those funds to change the landscape. So as always, there are a lot of opportunities there. As it's always been said, Africa is the next growth pole. And at the end of the day, I always like to look at these things from a risk-reward framework. The higher the risk, the higher the opportunity. So Africa is open for business. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last but not least, Ms. Rivers.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, because number one, I like to say, and I go by my company name, Phoebe. I teach people how Phoebe did it. So in other words, U.S. businesses, if you're looking to go to Africa and do business on that continent, I actually do training and courses for U.S. businesses on how to go global. Tying into all the resources we've talked here and so forth, you've got to do your research. You've got to do your collaboration, even before you go on the ground, and be able to understand and build your strategy for marketing. So I think my contacts will be shared, but call me, we'll take you global.
Thank you to our panelists for excellent presentations and opening the door a little on a subject that is probably not very well known to most of our audience here in the United States, but one that has a lot of opportunities. Thank you to our audience for staying with us today. Sorry that we didn't get to all the questions, but that's just a sign of how interested people are. We hope to have another of these events sometime in the future, and wishing all of you a nice day. And as our panelists said, there might be risks, but there are also opportunities, but you'll never know if you don't go and check it out. So thank you very much, all of you, for being with us today.
Nicely said, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.